So thanks again, Sangat. When asking me to speak, Kamla wanted to know whether I am a practicing Christian. I said I'm not a regular churchgoer, but I try to be a practicing Christian, which is certainly not easy. So let me explain with a timeline, as one's experience is always situated in time. I was born in 1948 and brought up in a Roman Catholic family, say middle-class family, where my father was more liberal than my mother, as he was a student of philosophy and seemed to take the rigor of the institutional church with a pinch of salt. In my young days, Roman Catholics were focused on ritual observation, with very little focus on the Bible, which is the Christian holy book. I was an adolescent when between 1962 and 65, when Pope John the 23rd called for a rethinking, an opening of the windows, as he called it, within the church, when all the bishops of the world gathered in Rome to discuss how the church would become more relevant to the changing times. This was called the Second Vatican Council. This council took place 100 years after the First Vatican Council. I was fortunate to have been exposed very early to teachers and then in a student movement in Bangalore in the late 60s, who took seriously the changes proposed by the Vatican Council, where we learned that Jesus Christ and faith in Jesus Christ transcends Christianity. And hence, it was not the institution of the church that is so important, but living according to the teachings of Jesus that is important. The 60s were also an interesting time of social rebellion in several parts of the world. But I will mention here only the massive movement of the poor in the slums of Brazil, which was a largely Catholic country with a well-entrenched rich elite and an export-led cash crop economy. The people in the favelas, or the slums, were seeking justice and emancipation on the basis of the teachings of the Bible. They were interpreting the Vatican Council texts and the Bible with the help of Jesuit priests who were demystifying the Bible for them. They used tools of materialist reading of the Bible, which basically meant situating the Bible writings in the context of its time. They began to integrate Marxist analysis to help people understand why and how the rich became rich and how they were marginalized. For this, it was from this that the theology of liberation emerged. It may interest you to know here that the Old Testament of the Bible is also the story of liberation, as the Jewish people believed it was a God who led them out of bondage in Egypt. But the Jewish people fell constantly into unjust practices, even after being liberated. So when Jesus was born, as we read in the New Testament, the Jewish people were under the Roman Empire in what is today Palestine, Israel. And there was economic exploitation of the peasants on the one hand, and the burden of the moralistic synagogue on the other. So Jesus' mission was to again liberate the poor, the oppressed, the so-called prostitutes and the sinner from this moralistic institution, which was under the Roman Empire. Through his life and closeness to ordinary people, a lot of women too, Jesus, through his life, showed a different path of love and caring and creating new community of sharing. When the Jewish priests or elders reprimanded him for befriending the sinners and the prostitutes, he asked, Which of you could throw the first stone without guilt? Thus exposing their double standards. He spoke about God's kingdom, and when asked by a good rich man how he could enter the kingdom, Jesus answered, "Go and sell all you have and follow me." One cannot serve God and mammon at the same time. Hence, he was seen as a threat to the institution and was sentenced to death. There was nothing to prove him guilty, except that he claimed he was sent to fulfill God's law. I remember Nandita Haksar once saying, "This is the first documented trial in history, and an honest man was put to death." So during the 1970s, while the Bible became more accessible to all the poor, to all and the poor, it was also a time when the famous Paulo Freire developed the methodology called the pedagogy of the oppressed. All this rubbed off on us in the student movement, a middle-class student movement, urban student movement, as well as the group of priests who animated our student movement belonged to the same group as those who lived with the slum dwellers in Brazil, the Jesuits. It was a very exciting time. In the long vacation, the students in South India organized the Free University, discussing Marx, Paulo Freire's methodology, the Indian economy, and the Bible. These helped us put to rest the objections we had regarding church ritual and practice, with an understanding that the church is the people of God and not the institution, those who live by Jesus' teachings. So, while as we understood that God's kingdom is for all who live by the principles of justice, two important methodologies also emerged. The need for people's participation to improve their conditions, and education being a reflective rather than a banking process. My eyes were actually opened when I first went to visit Kerala in 1966. One of the reasons I was challenged to work with the fishing community is because the Bishop of Trivandrum told me that this was his community. The fisher people were his community, and that even the communists would not work with them. I was shocked and asked why. He said, because this is a backward caste and very poor. He was forward-looking and had made an intervention at the Vatican Council, seeking a church for the poor. When I began to live in the fishing community in 1967, I learned that even the church was divided on the base of caste, the Syrians and the Latins and several others. And even these churches were divided on the base of caste or subcaste. And one church would not permit people of another caste to be married or buried in their church. The fishing village I lived in, where all were Catholic, did not have a church. I also learned how the church collected and still collects tax from the fishermen, which actually was a nexus between the moneylenders, merchants, and the church committee. In fact, our first big fish worker struggle was against this nexus. And this resulted in a struggle with the merchants and the local church, and then the creation of the Fishermen's Cooperative, which grew to be quite famous. It was also used to create a cemetery to bury the dead, as the local church would not permit these fishers to be married or buried in their church. The bishop permitted us to begin services in our village with the assistance of a visiting Jesuit priest from the college nearby. So we had the freedom to develop the ritual practice ourselves. So when it was the women who were the prayerful ones in the community, we made them responsible for church activity and members of the church committee, much to the dismay of the neighboring communities where women did not sit on church committees. The church taxes were collected directly and not through the nexus of the middlemen and merchants. This was all before I claimed to be a feminist, because though I was very involved with women, I did not understand feminism, which came only in 79-80. So in the early 70s, I had met Gabrielle, who is well known in the Indian women's movement, and her husband Bas, both Christians. Gabrielle was from Berlin, and she and Bas had close links with people and churches in the Eastern Communist bloc. We were also fortunate to participate in a long session on religion and development, at which another priest, Francois Huttard, who had worked in Brazil, shared with us the spirit of the new Brazilian church and introduced us to a methodology of social analysis. Simply speaking, applying Marxist tools to understand society. In this way, we also understood how the institutions of religion upheld and legitimized the status quo and interpreted the biblical texts to suit them. So then we created a group called the Christians for Socialism, where, with the help of people like Bas and Gabrielle, we began to do what we called a materialist reading of the Bible and praying together when we met. We were from different Christian denominations. Right through the 70s and 80s, the ripples of the Vatican Council were flowing all over, and many people in the institutional church were also seeking ways to make their Christian practice more attuned to the teachings of Jesus Christ. Hence, in Kerala, we had a large group of priests and nuns who also got involved in the fishing community, living in the community, as also others with tribal communities, taking part in their struggles and going on hunger fast, etc. Actually, my transition to becoming a feminist was when Chaya Datta came back from the Netherlands in 1979 and explained to us her thesis and theoretical framework of how the exploitation of women had a material base, how the woman's sexuality and fertility and labor are exploited, and how these played out in the family, production, and the market. Basically, this was what patriarchy was about. This was a eureka moment for me. Suddenly, it all clicked. I could see it directly in fisheries and directly related to the exploitation of women and nature in the fisheries as well. We could now integrate all this into our social analysis and continue to read the Bible with new eyes. And I could give a more solid framework to why women's labor in fisheries not only sustain the family and community, but also the small-scale fisheries, and how violence in the sea through the use of destructive fishing technology impacted on the fish resources and also on violence in the family. But let me come back to Christianity part. We began to understand how translations and interpretations of the Bible could change completely the sense of the text. And reading new authors was extremely helpful. There were also several strong and wise women in the Bible, led by God's Spirit and displaying feminine courage that would not normally be mentioned. Gabriel introduced me to feminist theological writings, and it was all a revelation and exciting as well to see how women were unearthing so far hidden history. In the 1990s, translations of documents that were discovered of ancient times began to be translated and appear. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene, for instance, which not only proved that women were very much a part of Jesus's group, but that they also wrote. And they give a slightly different idea of what the community of believers are supposed to be. Today, young students also learn how Max Weber explained the Protestant ethic of capitalism and how work and thrift were deemed signs of one's calling to salvation, leading to wealth and accumulation. The Bible used to justify capitalism. We saw the Cold War between capitalist Western Europe and the communist Soviet Union, which are two different economic systems. When God, a social construct, is situated outside or above society, then the kingdom of God is in heaven above. Thereafter, achievable only after death. But when we create communities of justice and love, God is truly with us and among us, here and now. Even in Kerala, where the first communist government was elected to power in 1957, the church opposed strongly the educational bill when the government wanted to bring education institutions under the purview of the state. The church was the biggest player in education at that time, and big property owners too. There were Christians in the government as well, as Kerala has a population of 90% Christians, and some very rich as well. The government fell. Today in the church, the struggle against patriarchy is upfront. Women are now admitted to study theology, and their voices begin to be heard. They are struggling to change church practice as well. Bring to the forefront the various kinds of exploitation, both gender and economic, in the church institutions, exposing the pedophilia, sexual abuse, and rape that was all along hushed up or tolerated. Whereas in some denominations, women are ordained priests and also become bishops. This is not yet achieved in the Catholic Church. Nevertheless, in the 2000s, there is also a backlash. The conservatives have never disappeared, despite the Second Vatican Council. There has been the growth of the charismatic movement, putting trust in community worship and miracle healing. The last two popes brought back some of the old traditions in the practice, although this present Pope, Francis, is a breath of fresh air. He also comes from Latin America and from the same group of liberation theologians in Brazil, a Jesuit. He brings hope to those who are struggling for change, sticking his head out, but he's also being attacked from within. It was only in the late 1980s that I got familiar with Dalit issues and theology. Although I worked in the fishing community, which is categorized as a backward caste, amidst whom there were subgroups, living as they do by the sea, and being a community of very old converts to Christianity, around 400 years, they had or have an identity of their own, as they live in their own communities. Also, their material base is the sea, a common property, over which they are masters, with their skills and knowledge. Of course, fish smells, and hence the children of the fishers would be discriminated in school, and fish vendors not permitted on buses in the 1960s. And when we were there, our focus was to tell them, yes, we have to be clean, and this too will change because these are your rights. education, traveling on public transport, etc. The fish vendors were also the first to organize and ask for their rights to travel on public transport in 1979. I say first because the larger fish workers movement grew subsequently. But the Dalit oppression is different. Again, I learned all this through Gabrielle and the students she taught in Mathrai. Even in the Catholic Church, there was an outpouring of Dalit literature and forms of expression which brought new consciousness in the Catholic community as well. The politics of identity has come to stay. Our challenge as women is to now unitedly accept and transcend diversity to overthrow patriarchy and capitalism. Therefore, this conversation, I think, is so important, and I hope we will pursue it into the future. I'll stop for there now, Uma,